Hanımlar ve beyler hepinize saygı ve sevgilerimizi sunuyoruz. Bugün 19 Eylül 2024 ve TÜREB ile Yeşil Deniz'in yeni bölümüyle karşınızdayız. Bugünkü programımızın konuğu dünya çapında deniz üstü rüzgar enerjisinin gelişimine büyük katkılar sunan World Forum Offshore'un genel müdürü ve kurucu ortağı Gunnar Herzig. TÜREB olarak Türkiye'nin deniz üstü rüzgar enerji potansiyeline dair Türkiye'de farkındalık yaratmayı ve bu alandaki çalışmalara katkı sunmayı hedefliyoruz. Bu programda bu vizyonumuzun bir parçası. Türkiye'nin offshore rüzgar enerjisi sektörüne geleceği karşılayabileceği fırsat ve zorlukları ele alacağız bugünkü programımızda. Deniz üstü rüzgar enerjisi sektöründe yaşanan gelişmeleri, yüzer rüzgar türbinlerinin gelecekteki potansiyelini, Türkiye'nin bu sektördeki yerini ve yaklaşan WFO Global Summit 2025 hakkında da konuşacağız. Programın giriş ve kapanış bölümlerini her zaman olduğu gibi İngilizce ve Türkçe dillerinde yapacağım. Geri kalan bölüm İngilizce olacak. Ladies and gentlemen, we extend our warmest regards to all of you today, September 19, 2024, and we are back with a new episode of our program, TÜREB ile Yeşil Deniz. Our guest today is an influential figure in the global offshore wind industry, Gunnar Herzig, Managing Director and co-founder of World Offshore Forum. As TÜREB, our mission is to raise awareness of Turkey's offshore wind energy potential and contribute to the development of this field in our country. We gather with global experts all around the world to address the future opportunities and challenges that Turkey may face in the offshore wind sector. In today's program, we will discuss the global developments in offshore wind, the future of floating wind turbines, and Turkey's role in the sector, and the upcoming WFO Global Summit 2025, all with our esteemed guest, Gunnar Herzig. The introduction and closing of the program will be bilingual, while the remaining will proceed in English. Hi, Gunnar, welcome.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me. Great pleasure to be here.
It's our pleasure. Let's start with knowing you and WFO better. Could you please introduce yourself and your organization?
Yeah, sure, pleasure. So yeah, as you said, my name is Gunnar Herzig. I'm the managing director and co-founder of the World Forum Offshore Wind, or short, just WFO. And we are a non-profit organization focusing on offshore wind only. So really nothing else. It's all about offshore wind. And we try to promote and advocate for offshore wind globally. And we are still comparatively young. We were founded in 2018, and we are membership-based. We started with only 10 members from the global industry back in 2018, and we're now at 120 global members from Europe, Asia Pacific, North America, South America, Middle East. So it's really nicely coming together, this idea of having a global organization that promotes offshore wind and that connects the companies that are members. So we always think about ourselves as a global business platform, which allows companies from around the world to connect with each other, to exchange ideas. And we foster this exchange by having different committees, which are kinds of working groups, which always meet online, which is really convenient for people in different locations around the world. And then people can exchange ideas and develop solutions to some of the challenges and problems that we all together have as an industry.
Thank you. I also follow your work closely. We are reading your reports and enjoying them a lot, and also it improves, it helps the industry to raise the knowledge level. And one of your reports, like few of your reports, are focusing on the floating offshore. And it is now seen as the future of the industry, but that future doesn't seem to be coming on time, at least as it was anticipated. And can you please provide us your view for floating wind, maybe comparing also with the fixed bottom designs, and where do you see the potential growth here?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Floating offshore wind really is one of the biggest topics in the offshore wind industry in general. And kind of the basic fascinating idea behind floating offshore wind is that with floating foundations, you really remove the water depth as the limiting factor for offshore wind. Because with bottom-fixed offshore wind farms, you can really only install them in water depths up to maybe 60, 70 meters. If you go into deeper waters, it's really not technically and economically possible any longer to install bottom-fixed offshore wind foundations, because the foundations would have to be so gigantic that it would just not be possible to install them in a technically and economically feasible manner. And that would mean that if we were still, if we didn't have a solution to this limitation, then offshore wind would not be really a potential source for electricity production for all the deep water markets that we see in the world, and would really only be a limited option for some countries with comparatively shallow waters. Therefore, the big idea behind floating is to make offshore wind accessible to pretty much all markets around the world, also with deeper waters. And that is really why floating offshore wind would be a huge step for the entire industry, because then all the deep water markets around the world, like Norway, Spain, Portugal, the US West Coast, Australia, Japan, and really most of the world's markets, would also be in a position to build offshore wind farms and use offshore wind for their electricity production. But I think you're absolutely right pointing out that, it's not easy, and it's not, floating offshore wind is not something that just is done easily. It's a pretty kind of complex thing. But I think we are really working on it on a very kind of detailed level now. And we, as WFO, have a very dynamic committee, our floating offshore wind committee, where we have subcommittees which really focus on very specific things, like what do the mooring lines for floating offshore wind foundations need to look like? How do we deal with the cable situation? Because we would have floating cables, which is completely different from cables for bottom-fixed installations. What about insurance? The insurance perspective. Are insurance companies happy to provide insurance coverage for floating offshore wind farms? And there are many things, also the operation and maintenance phase. How do you do that? Do you do the operation and maintenance offshore, or do you kind of disconnect the turbine and tug them into the harbor and then do your repair works? So there are still a lot of questions surrounding floating offshore wind, but we really share the view that we need to get things right before we go into commercial scale floating wind. And I think we're on a pretty good path now, where we really get down into the technical details of making sure that we get floating wind right. And then we can really kind of move to commercial scale floating wind by the end of this decade. So around 2030, I'm pretty confident that we will see the first global commercial scale floating offshore wind farm. We already have quite a few successful demonstration projects out there, or even kind of pre-commercial size projects. Maybe the biggest one currently is the Hywind Tampen project in Norway with 88 megawatts, which is already pretty significant. But I think we saw some great news for the floating offshore wind industry in the recent UK auction, which was announced a couple of weeks ago, where we saw a big 400 megawatt floating project, which received an attractive strike price. And that is now, or could really be, the first commercial scale 400 megawatt project that might be up and running around 2030. And I think that is really very positive news for the industry. And that's what we need, the first successful commercial scale project. And then I'm sure floating offshore wind will have a fantastic future around the world and can really contribute significantly to many countries' electricity demand.
Okay, my questions will be at the end. So I have a few, but I will hold it. So the Then how you mentioned that WFO is facilitating collaboration between private sector members, and how do you exactly do it? Can you provide us some more input on that? And also, how do you address the common challenges we have for offshore, such as like regulatory barriers, financing, and supply chain constraints?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of kind of fostering the exchange between our members, we really try to use all the channels that we have. As I already mentioned, we have our committees, which are kind of working groups. We have those for floating offshore wind, but also for offshore wind to hydrogen, for offshore dispute resolution. So for different topics, we offer those committees, which are always consist of online meetings. So you don't need to travel anywhere. You just join them from your computer. And therefore, they really work well in an international context. So you do have people from all over the world meeting and discussing in those meetings. So that's definitely one aspect that works very well for us. In addition, we provide forum for exchange in our live conferences. We had one in Barcelona earlier this year, which we'll do again early next year. We had a conference with our regular Asia Pacific conferences, which were in Tokyo earlier this year, in Taiwan last year. So we really try to provide live opportunities for people to present their ideas, to discuss how to address some of the challenges. And then we also have more informal exchanges, little networking receptions, usually in connection with larger industry events. And here again, we try to just bring people together, foster the exchange, and let people exchange ideas. And so far that worked quite well. And we saw many cases where companies met through our network, through our platform, and are now working together. Companies from Australia and Germany, for example, or Japan and the UK, because you really need this kind of platform to meet. And we as WFO really try our best to provide an attractive platform to allow for this kind of idea exchange and discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, then let's discuss about the technological side of it. In your view, what key innovations and technological advancements are in the horizon for offshore wind, and how could they impact the LCOE and the industry's overall growth trajectory?
Yeah, I think very relevant question, because addressing the costs of offshore wind electricity, so the LCOE, is really one of the top focus areas these days. And I think if we discuss that in connection with kind of technological developments, we need to differentiate a bit between bottom-fixed offshore wind and floating offshore wind. Because for bottom-fixed offshore wind, I would say it's really all about kind of the delivery and just improving the way we do things, but the fundamental setup, foundations, turbines, and all the rest is very established by now. So I think we're not really looking for fundamental technical innovations, how to design a turbine differently, or how to fundamentally change a monopile or so. It's always about making things better and maybe bigger, increasing monopile length and diameter, for example, which is quite a technical advancement. But it is maybe not a revolutionizing thing. And same goes for installation of offshore wind turbines. You can always improve the installation process in terms of having better noise mitigation, for example, when you install foundations, or better lifting procedures. But I would say for bottom fixed, we're talking about kind of incremental improvements. And in the past, it was always said that we need bigger turbines because that would really bring down costs significantly. That might be right in principle, but I think we've now reached a point where people are saying, well, let's try to hold it a bit and not to increase turbines even further, because that always means designing bigger foundations, designing bigger installation vessels, and so on. So there's always a bit of a kind of serious repercussions if you increase the turbine size. So in order to bring down costs, what you usually need to apply is economies of scale. So you roll out the same product, or you produce the same product over and over again, and that really brings down costs. So what we hear from many people in the industry is, let's maybe use the turbines we currently have and try to produce as many of them as possible, and then we can adjust all our other equipment to those turbines, foundations, installation vessels, crane capacities, and so on. And therefore, I think in the bottom fixed world, people are not looking for phenomenal technological innovations, but really on improving the material and the processes that we currently have. For floating offshore wind, it might be a bit different, because here we're talking about a newer kind of thing, a newer type of offshore wind, and we still see a lot of very exciting innovations, different floating foundations. But I think also here we're slowly seeing the requirement from the market to really zoom in on maybe a couple of preferred or most mature foundation types, and then those types can really be produced in large quantities, which brings down the price, which is something we still need to achieve for floating offshore wind. And therefore, we still have a bit of kind of innovation going on for floating offshore wind, and many of the things surrounding floating offshore wind still require a lot of innovations. But I think ultimately, we always want to, at some point, leave this innovation phase and really go into serial production, mass production, because that's what brings down costs. And we cannot kind of constantly innovate and always change the whole design and setup. That is a bit difficult for the supply chain, also for investors who always need kind of a track record. So before you really buy a turbine, it needs to have been operating for a couple of years. Same for a floating foundation. You really want to see, as an investor, a successful prototype which has been out in the water in real world conditions for some years, so you can really collect data, and then you're ready to fully commit to a commercial scale project with that kind of equipment. But I think, there are always great innovations going on, but I would say not on a fundamental scale. And in a way, floating offshore wind in itself is, of course, a gigantic innovation, and something like using offshore wind electricity for green hydrogen production. That would also be a big innovation, but that is more about the kind of the context of offshore wind, which would be a big thing. But I think the basic setup, especially for bottom fixed offshore wind, already works very well. Floating will have hopefully its breakthrough within this decade. So by the end of the 2020s, we'll see a bigger commercial scale floating offshore wind project up and running. And then I'm sure we'll also see more innovations around producing green hydrogen or energy storage. But those would be innovations, I would say, in the environment or in the context of offshore wind, not around the offshore wind farm setup itself.
Yeah, I also would like to see a future where we can really feasibly use green hydrogen, but also it seems like it is being postponed to a later future.
Exactly. Absolutely. It was just saying, you're fully right. And we have our Offshore Wind to Hydrogen Committee, which really tries to address the significant challenges we still have around that. So I fully agree. It's maybe something for the 2030s, but I think we already need to think about it now, about offshore wind to hydrogen, to really make sure, we work on credible solutions.
So Turkey, as you know, Turkey haven't leased any area for offshore wind yet. We have some developments this year where we started implementing measurement campaigns in the Marmara Sea Basin. So hopefully we will be able to achieve the goal of 5 gigawatt installed power by 2035. But so now we consider ourselves as an emerging market for offshore wind. In your opinion, what are the most significant emerging markets for offshore wind? And do you specifically do any work to help those markets?
Yeah, great question. So I think indeed we have a lot of very promising emerging markets nowadays. So Turkey, definitely one of them. Also markets like Norway, Spain, Portugal, Greece potentially. Then Asia Pacific, I think Vietnam, Philippines are looking interesting. India just launched its latest offshore wind tender earlier this week, I believe. Australia is now looking quite interesting. And therefore, I think there are quite a few emerging markets. We as WFO always try to connect with those emerging markets. We did a bit of work for the Indian government when it was around kind of best practices for an auction design. So we definitely are always very interested in working with emerging markets and trying to kind of direct the interest of the global community to those emerging markets. But I think one thing all emerging markets have to realize is by now you have quite a big global offshore wind market, and even the biggest companies are probably not in the position to cover all markets. So it's really about being as attractive as an offshore wind market and with regards to a regulatory framework as possible, because there's really quite a bit of competition between all those emerging markets.
Okay, then what do you see as Turkey's potential in the global offshore wind market?
Yeah,
and please also address this issue by considering the supply chain, because Turkey is a very important part of the onshore wind supply chain of Europe. We are the fifth. Some years we are the fifth, some years sixth, but we are usually on average the fifth largest industry, offshore wind industry in the European continent. So please also try to address what we should do if we want to integrate Turkey to the offshore wind supply chain as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you're absolutely right. The kind of the potential, the fundamentals for Turkey are definitely there in terms of offshore wind. I mean, obviously, Turkey has a fantastic, gigantic coastline with very attractive wind conditions. So I think, there is more than enough potential for offshore wind in Turkey. I think we've seen some studies that say around, 65 gigawatts is the technical potential, maybe 12 bottom fixed, the rest floating. So, and even if just a kind of a fraction of that would be built, I think that's still a very kind of strong position to start from. So I think the potential is there and people recognize that. And as you say, the fact that Turkey has a very strong industrial base already in the onshore wind business, that is always very helpful. So I think that means that you can use that to a large extent. Some components will also come from other countries, but you can really build on what you already have, all the knowledge, the industry, supply chain. So I think that is a huge plus for the Turkish market. And I think what is, the only thing that's missing really is the clear regulatory framework. And I think that is always the fundamental thing for energy companies that they are looking for. Do you have a clear regulatory framework in place which really allows companies to know how the process works, which areas in the sea are kind of prioritized for offshore wind that is usually done via some marine spatial planning? How does the grid connection work? Who does it? Is it some grid operator or the owner of the wind farm? Which permits do you need? Do you have a kind of one-stop shop agency or ministry that takes care of the whole permitting process? Or are different ministries involved? What does the permitting process look like to really get your permit to be able to build the offshore wind farm? And then the whole question around kind of what does the offtake mechanism look like? Do you have some kind of contracts for difference model in place, or a feed-in tariff, or some other kind of remuneration model? You can have really anything you want, but you just need to tell the market what the system is. Do you also allow for kind of private market power purchase agreements where you can sell parts of your electricity to big industrial off-takers, and how does that work? So it's really this kind of regulatory framework that needs to be in place, and that needs to be as clear and easy to understand as possible. And then I think Turkey would be a fantastic offshore wind market, and many developers from around the world would be very interested in engaging with the Turkish offshore wind market.
Yes, so the capacities, the technical potential you mentioned is like work done by, I think, with the support of the World Bank. And maybe it's also very tricky how you define the technical potential. What is feasible and what is not? Like it's very subjective. It's a very subjective term. But we also do our own assessments as the Turkish Wind Energy Association to understand the technical potential of offshore wind in Turkey. And we recently completed a work where we defined 20 zones for fixed bottom offshore wind development, and we have actually considered that like the potential is around like 1,400 turbine locations for an area that can contain 1,400 turbine locations. But what is the portion of feasible feasible layouts? I cannot say because it's very subjective. Before I get to my last question, I think it's better to have some questions because I've received some messages. So you've mentioned, yeah, like people have the same concern. You mentioned that like commercial maturity for floating wind could be achieved by 2030, but what does that mean? What price basically do you think it's mature commercially?
Yeah, good, a very good question. So I think we always have to break it down into different kind of elements of success. So I think the first thing that people really want to see is just that floating offshore wind works on a commercial scale, which is why it's so important to have this first commercial scale. So several hundreds of megawatts of installed capacity in the water, because so far, I think the biggest project so far, the Hywind Tampen project, that's 11 turbines, I believe. So still much more complex than just having 5 turbines, but you really need a bigger wind farm so that you have tens of turbines and you can really prove that you can handle the complexity of all the kind of underwater cables and mooring lines and everything, which is sometimes called a spaghetti bowl beneath the water, because that really is quite complex. Just the installation, then doing repair works or so. So we need to show that it works on a commercial scale, but you're absolutely right. At what price? So the price is the fundamental question. And I think a good guidance for the price is the latest UK CFD auction, where the strike price, which is always expressed in a strange term of British pounds, but at the value of 2012. So it needs to be index adjusted. And I think the value was £139 in 2012 terms, which is above around £200 in today's money. So that might be the rough, and that's the strike price in the CFD auction for this 400 megawatt wind farm. So maybe that's the price we're currently talking about for floating wind, but hopefully we can bring that down significantly once we think about economies of scale and really producing floating foundations in large volumes, which will bring down the price significantly. But I fully agree, that's the main thing we need to address, the costs of floating wind, but that can really only be done once we go into commercial scale. And therefore, we need to prove that it works on a commercial scale, because only then investors, insurance companies, banks will really be happy to lend money to 500 megawatt floating offshore wind farms and not just to small demonstration projects. So we need that kind of step-by-step approach. And then I think, costs will come down, as we have seen for bottom-fixed offshore wind, where people could almost not believe the cost decrease that the industry has achieved over 20 years. And I think the same will be true for floating offshore wind.
What do you think about the strike price of 95 euros that we saw in France?
Yeah, good question. So that is going to be a very interesting case. And from my perspective, I think the strike price we saw in the UK is much more realistic. So I think the South Brittany strike price in France is quite ambitious, and I think the industry was a bit hesitant and is now very interested to see how this project is going to develop. But it's definitely, I think, quite an aggressive price, and maybe the UK's price is a bit more realistic. But there are also some differences in the auction design and what is part of the package in France. But still, it's definitely a ambitious price, definitely.
Yeah, I know that in France the grid connection is the responsibility of the TSO, but still, like, it's very high, very low. You are right. I agree with you. One of our audience want to know what is the condition to be a member of your working groups.
Yes, it's very straightforward. You just need to join WFO as a member, and then we have very straightforward categories depending on the size of the company or the organization in terms of annual turnover, annual revenues, and then you just let us know which category your company belongs to, and then there's an annual membership fee, and that's all you have to do to join. And then we welcome anyone who has anything to do with offshore wind, who is interested in working with us. And once you are a member, you are allowed to join all activities that we have. So there are no different types of membership, just one type of membership. And once you are a member as a company, anyone from your company can participate in any of our activities. So it's very, very simple. And if you're interested, or any of your listeners, always feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be more than happy to provide more information.
Thank you. There are many more questions, but I don't want to keep you for longer than what we have planned. So then could you please inform us about the upcoming event, Global Summit 2025?
Yeah, with pleasure. And I think we have two brief slides which kind of give you a bit of an impression of what we're talking about. So this Global Summit, which will be held in Barcelona early next year, is already the second summit that we're doing in Barcelona. We had one earlier this year, and it's really all about offshore wind on a global scale. So it's a nice 2-day event with around 200 guests. And if we go to the next slide, you can see some nice information about the event. So it's really 200 guests roughly from all over the world, 40 speakers roughly. And we really did try to discuss offshore wind in all its different perspectives. So we start with global offshore wind policies. We have a floating offshore wind session. We discuss supply chain and finance, and then innovations, including offshore wind to hydrogen. So we really try to bring expert speakers and experts as guests together from around the world to have a interesting discussion and get together in Barcelona for 2 days with lots of networking opportunities, just to exchange ideas and talk to each other. And if any one of you is interested, it would be great to see you in Barcelona early next year at our WFO Global Summit.
Thank you, Gunnar. We have come to the end of yet another insightful conversation. Thank you much for your time and sharing your vast expertise with us today. Your insights into the global offshore wind sector, particularly the floating wind and Turkey's potential, have been invaluable. We are also excited about the Global Summit. I am personally planning to be there to see the impact on the industry, the WFO's impact on the industry.
Great, thank you very much. My pleasure.
Değerli izleyenler, bir programımızın daha sonuna geldik. Gunnar Herzig'e bugün bizimle olduğu için ve değerli görüşlerini paylaştığı için tekrar teşekkür etmek istiyorum. Deniz üstü rüzgar enerjisinde özellikle de yüzer rüzgar türbinleri ve Türkiye'nin bu alandaki potansiyeline dair çok önemli bilgiler paylaştı. Yine WFO'nun Barcelona'da düzenlenecek Global Summit 2025 etkinliği hakkında da bizi bilgilendirdi. Kendisine teşekkür ederiz. Etkinliğin sektöre büyük fayda sağlayacağına eminim. Programımızın gerçekleşmesinde emeği geçen Mesut Bey'e tekrar teşekkür etmek istiyorum. Offshore rüzgar enerjisinin geleceğini birlikte şekillendirmek için bu tür önemli tartışmalara devam edelim. Katılımınız ve katkınız için teşekkür ederim. İyi günler.